A newborn was left in a basket on his fence. The note named him as the father. The basket was there before first light. I know that because I heard the dog go quiet, and Amos didn't go quiet for anything that didn't matter. I'd been awake already. Bad habit of a man who spent too many years sleeping one eye open. The stove was cold, and I was sitting at the table with yesterday's coffee and the deed paperwork for the Orvilles, trying to find the line where the county surveyor had shaved 8 feet off their eastern boundary and hoping I was wrong. I wasn't wrong. I'd known for 3 days I wasn't wrong, but I kept hoping. When Amos went quiet, I set the papers down. It wasn't a strange sound that followed. That was the thing. It was no sound at all. The dog had stopped pacing the porch, stopped the low, worried shuffle he made when a coyote nosed too close to the hen line. Just stopped. And in that quiet, after a minute, I heard something else. Thin, high. The sound a very new thing makes when the world turns out to be colder than wherever it came from. I had my boots on before I knew I was moving. The basket was a feed basket, the kind any ranch hand might have left by a gate. Woven tight, handle looped over the second fence post from the corner. Someone had wedged it so it wouldn't swing. That was the detail that stopped me, that whoever did it had thought about the swinging. Had thought it should not swing. Had taken the time in the dark, afraid to be careful about that. Inside, wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled of cedar and lanolin, was the smallest living thing I'd seen since a foal born too early the winter of '83. Maybe 6 pounds, maybe less. A face like something folded and not yet unfolded, red and furious, and working hard at the business of making that sound. Under the blanket, pinned to the inside of the basket with a thorn broken off my own fence, she'd taken it right off the post, was a piece of paper folded twice. I took the basket inside before I read it. That comes first, I thought. Get it inside. I set the basket on the table where the deed papers had been, moved the lamp closer. The baby had gone quiet when we came in out of the wind, which I took as a mercy, or maybe a comment on priorities. The note was written in pencil, and the hand was educated, slanted, sure, even if it was rushed. Whoever wrote it had been taught to write by someone who cared. It said, "His name is Daniel. He was born 4 days ago. I cannot keep him safe and I cannot keep him hidden, and those 2 things leave me no other door. The man who should answer for this will not answer for it, but you will. You are Cole Braddock and you are the law in this county, and if that means anything at all, let it mean this, that no one will take him from you. Keep him. Please keep him. I have no one else to ask." It wasn't signed. I read it twice. Then I looked at the baby, who had worked one fist free of the blanket and was holding it in the air the way a man holds something up to show you he's not hiding anything. Daniel, the name sat there in the lamplight like a thing that had always been there. I want to say I knew what I was doing when I went to the back room and got the spare quilt and folded it into the bread box to make something that might hold him while I figured out milk. I want to say it was a decision, the kind a man examines and approves of before he makes it. It wasn't. I just did it. Because the basket was on my table and his name was Daniel, and someone had trusted me with the only thing they had left to trust anyone with. That's the part I've come back to over the years. Not the baby in the basket, but the thorn. She'd walked up in the dark, in whatever fear she was carrying, and she'd stopped to break off a thorn from my fence and use it to pin that note so it wouldn't slip. So I'd find it, so it would be there when I found it. That was the moment I became his father. Not legally, not yet, but in the way that actually counts, which is when you look at something that needs you and you stop thinking about what it costs. Odelia Foss came by at sunup. She was my neighbor to the north, widow, 60-something, ran 60 head of Herefords on her own and did it better than most men ran 100. She had opinions about everything and shared them freely, and I'd learned over 4 years that she was right about most of them, which made it inconvenient to argue. I hadn't sent for her. She'd heard the baby through the window when she rode past. Odelia Foss did not ride past anyone's window at sunup without a reason, but she said she was checking the fence line, and I let her have it. She came in and looked at the basket, which I'd moved to the center of the table because I didn't know where else to put it, and she looked at me and she said, "You got cow's milk?" I was about to go get some. "Goats is better, I'll send Remai with some." She pulled off her gloves and leaned over the basket and made a sound I'd never heard her make before, something low and comfortable like a dove calling. The baby turned toward it. "He's jaundiced some. How old?" "Note says 4 days." She picked him up. She did it the way you pick up something you've picked up 1,000 times, and I noticed I'd been holding my breath until she had him settled in the crook of her arm. "The note named you." "It named me as the law." Odelia looked at me over the top of that small red head. "Same thing," she said. She didn't ask me who the mother was. I was grateful for that. I told her I didn't know because I didn't. She accepted that with a nod that meant she believed me, and also that she'd formed her own opinion and would keep it, which was the Odelia Foss way. She stayed 2 hours, showed me how to get milk into him with a dampened cloth, and then with a spoon that she bent herself over my knee with her bare hands, which I watched with some amazement. She showed me how to hold his head, where to put my thumb, how long to wait. She showed me what a settled baby sounded like versus one who was working toward something urgent, and how to tell the difference. She showed me other things too, things I had no language for. The way to walk the room when he wouldn't stop, a slow particular circuit that she demonstrated twice without explaining why it worked, and it worked. The way to judge temperature by the back of his neck rather than his hands. The way to tell real distress from the normal fury of a small person discovering that the world is vast and unconsulted and occasionally cold. I wrote some of it down on the margin of the Orville deed. The rest I remembered because I had no choice but to remember. When she left, she put her gloves back on and said, "You'll hear from Harlan Stroud before noon. He's got opinions about this and he'll want you to know them." Harlan Stroud was the county commissioner. He had opinions about everything that happened within 30 miles, and his opinions tended to arrive with the expectation that they'd be acted on. "I'll manage Stroud," I said. "Yes," she said, "you will," and she went out. Stroud came at 11. He brought his son-in-law, Peckworth, a pale man who moved like he was always watching for exits, and he brought Doc Reese, which surprised me until I realized Stroud had brought him not for the baby's benefit but as a kind of evidence. Something official-looking. I met them on the porch. I didn't invite them in. Stroud was a large man who'd been handsome once and hadn't entirely forgiven the world for the change. He stood with his thumbs in his vest pockets and looked at me with the expression he used when he was about to say something reasonable that wasn't reasonable at all. "Cole," he said, "hell of a situation." "Morning, Harlan." "Foundling child, no clear parentage, county's got to be involved. That's just how it works." "County's not involved," I said. He blinked. "Now, Cole. The child's in my care. That's a private matter between me and whoever left him. Doesn't touch the county." Peckworth shifted beside him. Reese was looking at his boots, which told me what he thought of this errand. "You can't just keep a baby that showed up on your fence," Stroud said, and there was an edge in it now, the edge he used when he decided something and wanted you to know the deciding was done. "I can keep anything left on my property that requires care," I said. "I'd do the same for a foal." "He's not a foal, Cole." "No, he's a boy. And he's got a name and he's got a home, and I'd like you to ride back to town and let me get on with the work of the day." Stroud looked at me for a long time. He was calculating, I could see it, the way he always calculated, weighing what he could push against what pushing would cost him. I'd been the law in this county for 11 years. He tried to make trouble for me twice in that time, and both times it had come back around in ways he hadn't enjoyed. "This will become a legal question," he said. Probably, I agreed. And when it does, you'll find I've handled it correctly. He left. Peckworth went with him like a shadow that didn't want to be there either. Reese stayed. You want me to look him over? Reese said when the others were down the road. I'd appreciate it. He came in and did a proper examination and told me what Odelia had already told me, a little jaundiced, healthy lungs, good weight for 4 days old. He told me a few things Odelia hadn't, about what to watch for in the first weeks, about warmth and feeding intervals. He wrote some of it down on a scrap of paper and left it on the table. At the door he stopped. The woman who left him, he said, without looking at me, she'd have delivered without a doctor. You understand what that means in terms of condition. I understand. If she came to you, I'd see she got what she needed, I said. That's all I can tell you. He nodded. He understood that I didn't know, and that if I had known, that answer would have been the same. I had a deputy named Garrett, who was 24 years old and conscientious to a degree that occasionally made him difficult to be around. He came the next morning and stood in the doorway looking at Daniel in the breadbox stern cradle with an expression I can only describe as careful. You're keeping him, Garrett said. I am. Stroud saying in town it's irregular. Stroud says a lot of things. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then, you need anything, Sheriff, from town. Blankets, I said, the flannel kind, and whatever Hartley's got for infant feeding, a proper bottle if he's got one. Tell him it's for me. Garrett rode out and came back that afternoon with blankets and a glass bottle with a rubber stopper that Hartley had special ordered from back east and never sold, and was glad to be rid of. He also brought a pork roast from the diner, which nobody had asked him to bring, wrapped in brown paper and left on the table without a word about it. I ate standing at the stove. Daniel slept in the bread box. Outside the wind had turned and was coming from the south, which meant the cold was breaking, which meant spring was deciding to make its move. I thought about the note all that week. Not about who wrote it, I had theories about that which I kept to myself, but about the decision to write it. The decision to trust a name you'd only heard, a man you'd never met with the thing that mattered most. I've been trusted before. It's the nature of the badge. But that's a different kind of trust, professional, conditional, bounded by the job. What the note asked was something else. It asked me to be a person, not an office. It assumed I was a person who could be trusted with that. I didn't take the assumption lightly. I don't think I slept a full night that first week. Not from worry exactly. From the weight of it, the seriousness. You hold a child for enough hours, sitting up at 3 in the morning, the house dark and the lamp turned low, him working at the bottle with the concentrated effort of something that has only one job in the world and is doing it, and something happens that doesn't have a sensible name. You become responsible in a way that changes the shape of you. You are no longer just yourself. You are the person this specific creature depends on. And that is not a burden. That is the opposite of a burden. It is the feeling of finally being the right weight for the ground you stand on. She came back on the 9th day. I don't know what I expected. Nothing, maybe. The note had the feeling of a door closing, not a door left open. But on the 9th evening, just at last light, I heard Amos make the same silence he'd made the morning of the basket, that particular held breath quiet, and I went to the window. She was at the fence line, just standing there. She'd come on foot, which meant she'd left a horse somewhere back along the road, and the fact that she'd left a horse meant she was ready to run if she needed to. I noted that. I noted all of it, the way she held herself, slightly turned, the way she was watching the house and not the gate, the way she'd chosen the last of the light so she could see me before I could see her clearly. She was younger than I'd expected. 22, maybe 23. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, wrapped in a coat that was good quality but had been worn a long time. She had the look of someone who'd been sleeping poorly and eating just enough. She had the look of someone who'd made a decision she couldn't unmake and had spent 9 days living inside it. I went to the door and opened it. Didn't step out. Just opened it so she could see I wasn't armed, that I wasn't coming at her. She stood there looking at me. I said, "He's all right, come see." She didn't move for long enough that I thought she might turn and go. Then she unlatched the gate. Her name was Marisol Vega. She told me that much, sitting at the table, not looking at Daniel right away, looking at the table, at her hands, at anywhere but him, the way a person steels themselves before something they need to do and can't rush. She'd come up from the territory below the border line, the part the county maps called disputed, and the people who lived there called home. Her husband had been dead 14 months, killed in a claim dispute that the law on the Mexican side had closed without looking at, and the law on the American side had said wasn't their concern, because it hadn't happened in their county. The man who'd killed him had decided after that Marisol was owed something for her trouble. He had friends who felt the same. "He has a name," she said and stopped. "You don't have to say it." "Castellano," she said. "Rodrigo Castellano." She said it like she was putting something down she'd been carrying a long time. "He runs cattle across both sides of the line. He gives money to people on both sides of the line. That's what his money buys, that people don't look." "How far north does his money reach?" She looked at me then. "I don't know. Far enough that I couldn't go to anyone in the territory, far enough that I came here." I thought about the note. The man who should answer for this will not answer for it, but you will. "The child," I said, "he is my husband's son," she said, and there was a quiet steel in it that closed the question. "Mine, he is only mine." "Then why the note?" She looked at me steadily. "Because Castellano knows. He found out about the pregnancy before I crossed the line. He had men watching. He believes the child will be leverage, that if he has the child, I come back. I needed Daniel somewhere that Castellano could not reach." She paused. "I needed him behind the law, your law. I needed him to be yours so that anyone who came looking would have to go through you." I sat with that for a moment. "And if I'd handed him to the county," I said. "Then he would have ended up with the county, and the county can be bought. You can't." "How do you know that?" She almost smiled. Just almost. "Because in 14 months I asked about every man with a badge between here and the Rio Grande. Yours was the only name no one tried to sell me." I got up and refilled the coffee, set a cup in front of her. She hadn't touched the first one, but she picked up the second. "He's 9 days old," I said. "He needs his mother." She looked at Daniel then. Finally looked at him, really looked, and I saw what it cost her, all 9 days of it, compressed into the way her breath changed. She didn't cry. She was too worn down for tears right then. But her hand moved across the table and touched the edge of the bread box, just the edge, like she was making sure it was real. "I can't protect him," she said. "Not from Castellano, not on my own." "You don't have to do it on your own," I said. She looked at me. "Castellano crosses that border line," I said. "He's in my county. That means he's in my jurisdiction, and I have opinions about men who use children for leverage." "He has men." "So do I." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the night was very still, the kind of still that comes when the weather is deciding something. "I left my horse 2 miles back," she said finally. "I didn't know if I could come back. I didn't know if it was fair to." "The horse is all right where it is for tonight," I said. "Drink the coffee." She stayed that night. Odelia Foss's spare room was the option I offered and the one she accepted. I rode over ahead of her to speak to Odelia, who opened her door at 8 in the evening without a flicker of surprise, and said yes before I finished asking. I lay awake that night listening to the land. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the way a man gets when something has shifted, when the weight of things has redistributed, and he hasn't yet found his footing. I was 46 years old, and I had been a lawman for 22 of those years, first as a deputy in 2 other counties, and then here in this one, which was hard country, and had needed someone willing to be hard back at it. I'd built a life that worked, Solitary, but it worked. The ranch, the badge, the rhythms of it. I knew what a day was going to ask of me most days. I'd known that for long enough that I'd stopped looking for more to ask. And then a basket on a fence post, and a woman who'd walked up in the dark and taken care about a thorn. I thought about what she'd said. That mine was the only name no one tried to sell her. I'd spent 11 years building something in this county, not for praise and not for the record, just because there was a right way to do it and a wrong way, and I was only comfortable with one of them. I hadn't imagined that accumulating into something a woman in desperate circumstances could rely on. I hadn't thought about what the work looked like from the outside. I thought about it that night. I went to sleep eventually. In the morning she came back with Odelia, and without the watchful set of her shoulders from the night before. Not relaxed. I didn't think Marisol Vega had been relaxed in 14 months, but easier, like a spring wound down one turn. She went straight to Daniel. Picked him up with the practiced certainty of a mother who'd spent 4 days learning every inch of him before she gave him up. He recognized her, not in any way I could have proven, but I saw it. Something in him that settled, the way a thing settles when it finds the place it belongs. She sat by the stove and held him, and Odelia put coffee on, and I stood in the doorway not saying anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and I'd learned over the years, when the useful thing is silence. After a while she looked up at me. "You're going after Castellano." "I'm going to find out where he is and what he wants," I said. "Then I'll go after him. He'll have his men positioned. He knows I came north. He doesn't know you came here specifically. He'll find out. Before he finds out," I said, "I'll have had a conversation with the marshal's office in the territory, and with a man I know in the cavalry who has an interest in cross-border cattle movement." I paused. "Castellano operates in the gap between jurisdictions. The gap is going to get smaller." She watched me for a moment. "You've been thinking about this since last night." "Since the morning I read the note," I said. Something moved across her face, not the almost smile this time. Something quieter and more serious than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who's been carrying a problem alone for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like to put part of it down. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Everything you know about Castellano's operation. The routes, the men he trusts, who he pays and how much. The names of anyone along the line who'd talk if they felt protected." She nodded slowly. "I'll tell you everything I know." "Then that's what we start with," I said. The telling took most of a week. Not because she was reluctant, she wasn't, not once she'd decided, but because there was a lot of it, and she was careful, and I wanted her to be careful. Facts are only useful if they're right. She'd had 14 months to watch Castellano's operation from inside the fear of it, and she remembered detail the way people remember things when survival depends on memory. Dates she couldn't always fix precisely, but context she could fix precisely, which is sometimes better. I wrote it down in a ledger I kept locked in the second drawer. Names, routes, dates she could establish, the men who'd looked the other way and what they'd received for looking. The shape of a thing that had been able to operate because no single person held the whole picture of it. The picture existed, it just hadn't been assembled in one place. That's the work, getting the picture into one place. Garrett helped. He was good at listening to the parts that needed listening to and not pressing on the parts that didn't, which is a skill not every young man has and which I told him plainly I valued. He went red in the face when I said it, which was fine. There were evenings during that first week of the telling when Marisol would stop mid-sentence and go still, not because she'd forgotten what came next, but because she'd arrived at the part that cost something to say. I learned to wait those out. Not say anything, not prompt. Just sit there and let the silence do what silence does, make room for what needs to come at its own speed. She always found her way through. She was not a woman who stopped. We worked at it methodically, session by session, and what emerged was more complete than either of us had expected. I had the structure of it by the end of the week. A clear picture of a man who had built over 15 years a network of compliance bought with money, with fear, and occasionally with violence when the other two fell short. He wasn't a criminal in the way most people picture criminals. He was an operator, patient, organized, careful. He'd identified the gaps between jurisdictions and had built himself into them like water finding the cracks in stone. I'd seen the type before. The type is harder to move than the blunt ones. The blunt ones do something obvious and you respond to the obvious thing. The patient ones require patience in return. I had patience. Garrett helped with the correspondence. He had a better hand than I did, and the letters to the marshal's office needed to make a particular kind of impression. We were 3 weeks into it before I rode into the territory the first time, to meet with a man named Fuentes who had been Castellano's foreman for 6 years before a dispute over a debt had put them on different sides of a fence. Fuentes was cautious, and I didn't blame him. Cautious means you've thought about consequences, and I had the highest respect for a man who'd thought about consequences. He talked, not everything, but enough to confirm what Marisol had told me and add dimensions I hadn't had. The cattle numbers. The names of the buyers on the American side who knew what they were buying and bought it anyway. Those names were the useful ones. They were the leverage that made the whole arrangement work, and they were the leverage that would make the whole arrangement stop. I rode home from that meeting in the dark, which I don't recommend for the faint of heart, but which gives you a lot of time to think. The land out that way is a kind of flat that seems like nothing until you've ridden it in full dark with no lamp, and then you understand it's vast in a way the daylight conceals. I thought about Castellano the whole ride, and I thought about the men whose names I now had written in my ledger, and I thought about what needed to happen to make Marisol Vega and her son safe in a lasting way, and not just a temporary way. Temporary wasn't good enough. Marisol stayed at Odelia's. It was the arrangement that made the most practical sense, and Odelia took to it with a warmth that surprised no one who knew her. Within a week, Marisol was helping with the herd. Within 2 weeks, she was riding the north fence line with the same proprietary attention Odelia gave everything she considered her responsibility. I watched that happen from a distance and thought, there it is. There's the person she is when she's not afraid. She was someone who worked, not in the grim determined way of someone proving something, but naturally, the way breathing is natural, the way a person moves through a task because the task is there and needs doing and they're the one who can do it. She was precise about it and she was quiet about it and she didn't require recognition. The work itself seemed to be enough. I understood that. Some people are built that way. I've always thought it's the reliable ones. I found myself watching her more than was necessary when I'd stop by Odelia's to report on where things stood. Watching the way she moved through Odelia's yard like she was learning it, cataloging it, deciding what it needed. The way she listened straight on, no performing it, no filling the silence to show she was engaged. Just listening, taking it in, thinking. I'd been alone a long time, not unhappy about it, but alone. There's a difference between a life that works and a life that has everything in it that a life can have. I'd made peace with the first. I'd stopped thinking much about the second. She was making me think about the second again, which was inconvenient and also not unwelcome, and I wasn't sure what to do with the combination. I won't walk through all of it. Some of it was paperwork and correspondence, which is the real work of law that nobody tells stories about. Some of it was 2 hard rides into the territory, and 3 conversations with men who owed me things or wanted things from me and were willing to trade. Garrett was solid through all of it. He decided, somewhere around the 3rd day after Marisol came back, that the situation was comprehensible and worth his loyalty, and having decided that he brought everything he had to it, which was more than most men his age had, and I told him so, which embarrassed him, which I also told him was fine. Rodrigo Castellano crossed the line 6 weeks after the basket appeared on my fence. He came with 4 men, which told me he'd been listening to people who'd given him bad information about what he was riding into. Either that or he was arrogant, which wasn't impossible. I met him on the road north of the Alvarez crossing with Garrett and 2 men from the marshal's office, and a letter from the cavalry detachment that had been watching his cattle movements for 3 years and had been waiting for exactly this kind of error. It wasn't clean. These things rarely are. One of Castellano's men made a decision that was the wrong decision, and there was a difficult 10 minutes during which I was grateful for every one of those 22 years and what they taught me about the mechanics of staying alive while persuading other people to stop doing what they're doing. Garrett was nicked in the shoulder, putting an end to it. It bled more than it was, and he was furious about the sling afterward in the way young men are furious about anything that makes them look diminished, and I let him be furious about it because that was his right. But it's sorted. Things tend to sort when you've done the paperwork right, and I'd done the paperwork right. Castellano was taken south again by the marshal's people, who had the authority and the appetite for the charges that were waiting for him there. I sent the letter from the cavalry with him. I sent my own letter as well, detailing what Marisol had told me and what I'd corroborated, and I sent it to 3 different offices so that it lived in more than one place, so it couldn't be lost or buried or not noticed. That's the part people don't understand about this work. The shooting is the least of it. The paperwork is the point. The paperwork is the thing that stays. I told Marisol that evening. She'd been staying at Odelia's for 6 weeks by then, helping with the herd in ways that had impressed Odelia considerably, which was not a thing easily accomplished. She'd started riding the fence line in the mornings, which Odelia said she didn't need but accepted. She'd learned the North Pasture's weak places and addressed them without being asked. She was in Odelia's yard when I rode in, mending a section of wire with her sleeves rolled up and Daniel in the basket beside her. A different basket, one Odelia had produced from somewhere in her barn, bigger and sturdier, awake and watching the world with the particular intensity of a 2-month-old who finds everything extraordinary. I told her about Castellano and the letters and the marshal's office. I told her what it meant and what it didn't mean, that it was handled, but handled didn't mean erased, that she'd want to be careful for some time, that there might be more letters to write, more people to talk to, that it was the beginning of a long quiet after a hard noise, not an ending. She listened the whole way through, then she looked at Daniel. "He can have my name now," she said, "legally." "He can," I said. She looked back at me. "He can have yours too if you're willing." I hadn't been expecting that, which was something given that I'm not generally a man who gets surprised. I looked at her for a moment. "You want to think about that," she said. It was neither a question nor a suggestion, just a thing she was allowing me. "I don't," I said. She waited. "I've been thinking about it since the morning I found him," I said. "I just didn't have a right to say so until I'd handled what needed handling." The wire she'd been holding was still in her hands. She set it down slowly on top of the fence post. She came to where I was standing, just came over to me with no hesitation and no theater, and she put both her hands flat on my chest and looked up at me. She didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't need to. What was in her face was plain and direct, and the kind of thing a man can spend 20 years not believing he'll ever be on the receiving end of, the look that says, "You, not what you can do or what you've built or what you represent. Just you, standing here. This is where I choose to stand." I put my hand over hers, both of them, just held them there against my chest. Behind us, Daniel made a sound that was either commentary or satisfaction. Odelia Foss came out of the house, took one look at us, turned around and went back inside. I heard her say something to the empty kitchen that sounded like a prayer of conclusion. I couldn't tell which, and I didn't need to know. We were married in September. Reese did the legal certification of Daniel's birth first, which required some creative paperwork and Garrett's signature as a witness and 2 letters from the county recorder, who was a reasonable man when his hands were guided correctly. Daniel Braddock. Written down. Real. The wedding was small. Odelia, Garrett, Reese, a few of the neighboring ranchers who'd watched the whole business from a respectful distance and had formed opinions that were, on balance, favorable. Marisol wore a dress she'd made herself from blue cloth she'd bought in town, and she did her hair the way she'd done it the day I first really saw her in Odelia's yard, which I'd never told her I noticed, but I had. There is a particular thing that happens when a man who has been a long time alone stands next to a woman who chose him, not for what he could give her, not out of desperation or circumstance, but because she looked at him and decided he was worth standing beside. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't hit you like a stone. It settles in slowly, the way warmth settles into a cold room. The room is cold, and then it's less cold. And then at some point you notice it's warm and you realize it's been warm for a while and you just hadn't let yourself say so. I noticed it during the wedding, when Reese was saying the words and Marisol was holding my hand with that same flat, certain grip she'd put on my chest in Odelia's yard, and I looked down at her and she looked up at me, and I thought, this is a real thing. This is a true thing. Not something I hoped for. Not something I told myself could happen if the right sequence of events occurred. Something that actually happened without my managing it or earning it in any way I can point to. She just looked at everything I was and decided it was enough, decided it was what she wanted. That is not a small thing. I don't know how to make it sound as large as it is. We rode home after. Daniel was with Odelia for the night, her idea, delivered with the firm generosity she applied to everything. The ranch was quiet when we got there, the fall evening coming in blue and still, that particular hush that this part of the country gets in September when the heat has finally given up and the cold hasn't yet committed. I made coffee. Marisol stood at the window looking out at the land. "Tell me what it looks like in winter," she said. So I told her, the way the creek freezes at the bend first. The way the north pasture holds snow longer than any other piece of ground I own, something to do with the angle of the ridge. The way the light comes in January, low and white, and makes everything look like it's been drawn in pencil. The way Amos finds the patch of sunlight on the south porch and stays in it all day, moving an inch at a time as it moves, very serious about the whole enterprise. She listened to all of it, watching the dark come in through the window. "Good," she said when I was done. "Good. I want to talk about the thorn. Not the basket, not the note, just the thorn. The thing she broke off my fence in the dark and used to pin the paper so it wouldn't slip. I've turned that detail over in my mind more times than I can count in the years since. Not obsessively. Just the way you return to a thing that contains something you haven't yet fully understood. A man picks up a stone from a riverbed because the weight of it surprises him and he wants to know why it weighs what it weighs. That's the thorn for me. A man my age has spent a lot of time not being worth that kind of care, not in any dramatic way, just the ordinary drift of it, years of being competent enough that nobody worried about you, steady enough that nobody checked. The law is like that. You build a county that works and the county uses it and doesn't think much about the man who built it, which is fine. That's what you're there for. You don't go into this kind of work expecting people to consider what it costs. You do it because the alternative is someone else doing it badly, and you know you can do it right, and so you do. But it accumulates, the not being thought about, the being the thing others lean on without wondering what it leans on. I didn't know it had accumulated until she broke that thorn off my fence. She was in the dark, afraid, in pain that she didn't talk about for weeks, but that I could see in how she moved, and how she held herself in the mornings before she'd gotten warm. She just walked up to a stranger's fence and left the most important thing in her life in a basket on it, and before she left she stopped, she took the time, to make sure the paper would stay. That's not just being careful. That's being the kind of person who is careful about other people even when there's nothing left, even when you've given everything away. She was still thinking about what I'd find and how I'd find it. And then she trusted me, before she met me, on the basis of a name, and what a name had accumulated over 11 years of work that nobody much noticed. She decided that name meant something, and she bet Daniel on it. I've thought about what I gave her. The law, the badge, the county behind it, a safe place for her child. The work of clearing Castellano out of the space she needed to live in. Those are real things. I don't diminish them. But I've also thought about what she gave me, which is harder to name and which took me longer to understand. She gave me the thing I hadn't known I was missing, which is someone who looked at who I actually was, not the office, not the usefulness, not the function, and said, that's what I want. The man standing there in the lamplight reading a note pinned with a thorn, who went inside and made a bed out of a bread box before he'd even thought it through, because something needed him, and that was enough of a reason. She saw the whole of it. That's the only way I know how to say it. The part of a man that does the right thing when no one's looking, that gets up before light not because anyone will notice, but because the work is there. She saw that part and she chose it deliberately. She keeps choosing it every morning, which is a thing I didn't know I needed, and which I now cannot imagine doing without. That's the part that catches me sometimes still. When I'm sitting at the table before the house wakes up, when it's just the stove and the gray light coming in and the sound of the land doing what land does, and I think, this is real. This is not something I managed or arranged or earned through any particular plan. I did the next right thing and the next right thing, and one morning a basket was there and I went and got it, and it led me here. Here is better than anything I would have planned for myself. That's the truth of it. Daniel is 3 now. He has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which Marisol says is a catastrophic combination, and which she says with enough humor that I know she means it fondly. He has decided that Amos is his property, which Amos has accepted with the dignity of an old dog who has decided all changes are interesting, and most of them are tolerable. He is a healthy, loud, specific-minded child with opinions about his hat, a battered brown thing 2 sizes too large that he refuses to surrender, and strong preferences about which horse he sits on when I take him out to check the line. His favorite is the gray mare. She is 15 years old and has an excellent opinion of herself, and they get along perfectly, which tells me something useful about both of them. He asks questions constantly. Not the way a child asks questions to fill silence, but the way a child asks questions because he genuinely wants to know things, because the world is full of mechanisms and he wants to understand how they work. Why does the creek make that sound at the bend? Why does the hawk circle twice before it drops? Why do the cattle move toward the far fence before a storm? I tell him what I know, and when I don't know I tell him that too, and that seems to satisfy him. The honesty of not knowing as much as the knowing does. Marisol runs the south pasture now. Her idea, she walked it one afternoon in the first spring after the wedding, counted the grade, counted the water access, came back and told me what it could carry and what it would need, and asked me what I thought. I told her she was right. She had been. She built it up from nothing over 2 seasons, added the stock she judged it could support and no more, managed the water in a dry summer that would have tested most ranchers, and by the end of the 2nd year it was carrying more than either of us had projected. She is methodical and patient, and she does not guess when she can calculate. In the fall she rides it mornings the way she rode Odelia's fence line, just checking, just knowing. I watch her sometimes from the ridge, the figure of her against the early light, moving through the land with that unhurried certainty that is entirely her own. She has made this ground hers by the simple act of knowing it and caring about it, which is all any ground ever asks of anyone. The letters from the marshal's office confirmed Castellano's conviction in the spring of last year. The network he'd built took longer. There were threads to pull through 3 different jurisdictions, and the buyers on the American side had lawyers who earned their money. But we'd been careful and thorough, and the paperwork had been right, and careful and thorough, and right generally prevails if you give it enough time. Marisol read the letter twice and folded it and set it on the mantel, and in the evening she sat at the table and was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Done. Just the one word." I said yes. That was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. Garrett got himself a wife last spring, a schoolteacher from the next county over named Alina, who has his number in a way that delights me, and who has views about the filing system in the sheriff's office that I'm inclined to agree with. He stops by occasionally, the four of them. Alina has a boy from a previous marriage, a sharp-eyed 8-year-old who's already teaching Daniel to play cards, which I may live to regret, and there's something in those evenings I couldn't have told you I wanted before I had it. Something about being known and being among people who know you and don't need you to explain yourself. I spent a long time without that and didn't miss it because I didn't know what I was missing. Now I know. Odelia Foss comes by twice a week, and she has adopted Daniel as a project and is teaching him to assess livestock by eye, which he finds absorbing, and she is the most patient teacher I've ever watched work. When she thinks no one is looking, she holds his hand when they walk the fence line. I've never told her I've seen it. There are things you don't need to name to honor. You just notice them and you're grateful and you let them be what they are. There's a thing you feel when you see a woman who chose you freely out of her own clear mind, moving through your land like it's hers, because it is hers, because she made it hers, because she put her hands on it and decided it was worth the work. There's no word for it, not in any language I know well enough to use. It's something to do with being seen and being kept, and being exactly the right weight of a thing in a hand that wants to hold it. I am 62 years old. I have been a lawman for 38 of those years. I have buried 2 deputies and a friend, and a horse I loved for 14 years, and a woman I didn't love enough and am still sorry about. I have signed warrants and testified and ridden into things that needed riding into, and I have had days that felt like they would fold me and didn't, and I have come home to the same land over and over and found it exactly what I needed it to be. For a long time I thought that was enough. Not as a consolation, I mean I genuinely thought it was the full measure of a life. Work you believed in, ground you understood, a county that was a little better for you being in it. The quiet satisfactions of competence and solitude. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I was not a man who felt he'd been cheated or passed over. I was a man who had made a life that fit and was living in it. But a life that fits and a life that is full are 2 different things, and I didn't know that until the basket. Until a woman I'd never met broke a thorn off my fence in the dark and pinned a note to a blanket and trusted me with a child, and then came back 9 days later and stood at the gate and let me see her face. I've thought about what would have happened if she hadn't come back. If the basket had been all of it, if I'd raised Daniel alone and never known who his mother was, I would have done it. I want to be honest about that too. I would have raised him as my own without knowing her, because the decision to keep him was made the morning I read the note, and it wasn't conditional on anything. But I would have raised him with a question living in the house alongside us. The unanswered kind. The kind that shapes a man without his quite knowing it's shaping him. She came back instead. She latched the gate and walked up to the door and accepted a cup of coffee and told me the truth, and every piece of it was an act of courage that I counted then and count now. It cost her. All of it cost her. And she did it anyway, because she was someone who did what needed doing even when it cost her, and that is the whole of why she is who she is. Now I come home and there is a woman who looks at me the way Marisol looks at me, which is the way you look at something you are glad to have and intend to keep. Straight on, no flinching, no performance. Like I'm simply what she was looking for and she found me and that's the end of the search. I didn't know a look like that was something a man could receive without manufacturing a reason to discount it. I know now that you can just receive it. You can let it be true. And there is a boy who says Papa when I come through the door, says it the way a kid says a word that is the whole world pressed into one syllable, with no irony and no self-consciousness, and no idea yet that the world can make you careful about such things. He hasn't learned that yet. I hope it takes a long time. I hope by the time the world teaches him caution, he is already too well established in who he is for it to take root deep. He has his mother's eyes and he has my name. Both of those things are true at once, and neither of them is less true for the other. That's the thing about family that I maybe didn't understand before, that it isn't diminished by the seams in it. The seams are just where the pieces came together. The coming together is the point. When people ask, and they do ask, because people always want the story to have a shape they recognize, I tell them. A basket showed up on my fence line one morning before light and I went out to see what it was. That's all I say. Let them decide what kind of story that is. I know what kind it is. The kind where you do the right thing because it's right and you don't think past that. And then one morning you're sitting at the table where you used to sit alone, and there's a woman across from you who put her hands on your chest and looked at you like you were the place she decided to stay. And a boy with your name and her eyes climbing onto your knee with a hat he has opinions about. And outside the window the land is doing what land does, just being there, patient, real, asking nothing and giving everything. The basket's still out back. I kept it, hung it on the nail beside the door to the tack room where it's been for 3 years. Daniel asked me once what it was for. I told him it was where I found him. He considered that for a moment with the thoroughness he brings to everything, and then he said, "Found me where?" And I said, "Right where you were supposed to be." He seemed to find that satisfactory. He went back to what he was doing. Some things you don't need a reason for, you just keep them. And sometimes what you keep turns out to be everything.